Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
They said I should apply for financial aid, like I was some stranger knocking on their door. 2 weeks later, I watched a live stream of my brother unwrapping a freaking mountain cabin, for his mental wellness. And now they wonder why I don't pick up their calls anymore. Funny how quiet people make the loudest noise when they stop pretending everything's fine. When the cardiologist first told me I had dilated cardiomyopathy, my world didn't just tilt. It collapsed in slow motion, like one of those old barns in Kansas we used to drive past on family road trips. The kind my mom would say, just needs a new roof, while everyone else could see the rot had gone straight to the foundation. I was sitting there in that cold, bright exam room, the kind with those papery exam table sheets that make you feel like you're in a butcher shop, and all I could hear was the sound of my own pulse in my ears. Ironically loud for a woman whose heart was failing, the treatment was simple, at least in theory. A combination of surgery and medication with a recovery window of about 6 to 8 months. Doable if you had money, insurance, or family willing to help. I didn't have the first two. And as I quickly learned, the third was a fantasy I'd been nursing since childhood, like a doll with missing arms. Never useful, but somehow comforting in the dark. My parents always looked good on paper. Dad was a regional director for a construction supply company, button-downs and big laughs at barbecues. Always the first to donate when a coworker's kid needed money for a fundraiser. Mom was the kind of woman who brought a homemade bundt cake to every neighborhood gathering, with a voice that could calm a room full of crying toddlers, but eyes that could freeze a grown man mid-sentence if he tried to contradict her. And then there was Jeremy, 4 years younger, golden boy from birth. He cried once in front of my parents when he was 10, because his birthday cake had only his first name written on it. And the very next year, his party had a theme, a clown, and a local magician. When I was 10, I got a card with a Chris 20 and a reminder to say thank you. So no, I wasn't shocked when, after a week of working up the nerve to tell them about the diagnosis, my mom's response to "I need some help paying for surgery" was, "Honey, we love you, but you've always been independent. You've got to do this the way you've done everything else, on your own 2 feet." My dad chimed in a minute later with, "There are programs for this. You should apply for aid." No offer to co-sign, no mention of a loan. Just a polite push toward a bureaucratic maze I knew would eat up weeks I didn't have. I hung up, got in bed fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling for what felt like a year. In that moment, something inside me quietly shifted, like a door creaking shut behind you when you weren't even sure you wanted to leave the room in the first place. And that was before the cabin. 2 weeks later, I opened Instagram while sitting in the car outside the hospital, waiting for my post-op consultation results. I'd just spent 2 hours being poked and scanned, swallowing pills I couldn't pronounce, and doing breathing tests that made my chest feel like it was filled with gravel. I tapped through the stories aimlessly, eyes half-focused, when I saw Jeremy's face, flushed with excitement, standing in front of a log cabin with big bay windows and a wraparound porch. There were balloons, champagne, and one of those big, ridiculous happy birthday signs staked into the snow-covered lawn. The caption on my mom's video said, "Surprise! Your own peaceful getaway in the mountains. You've earned it, sweetheart." The words hit harder than any diagnosis. My ears started ringing, and my vision tunneled until all I could see was the smile on his face and the hashtag she added, #family first, family first. That's rich. I didn't call them, I didn't comment or like the post. I just watched the video over and over, noticing little details, the leather recliner already set up in the corner, the fire pit stacked and ready, the fridge stocked with imported beer. They'd been planning it for months. While I was begging for enough cash to cover a deductible, they were hiring a contractor to make sure Jeremy had heated floors in the guest bathroom. I wondered if they'd even told him about my condition. He hadn't reached out. Not once. And just like that, the feeling of being a burden melted away and hardened into something else, something sharper. Resentment has a taste, and I remember the first time I really noticed it. It was bitter and metallic, like biting your tongue on purpose. I thought about every family dinner where Jeremy's stories were met with laughter, and mine were met with, "Oh, Lauren, not everything has to be so intense." I remembered every time they asked me to give him a ride, lend him money, cover for him at Thanksgiving when he was just too tired to show up. And now, as I sat outside the hospital with a paper bag full of prescriptions I could barely afford, I realized they hadn't changed. I had just finally opened my eyes. Later that night, Mom texted. Just a simple, "Hey, you okay? You've been quiet lately." I stared at that message for 5 minutes, wondering what would happen if I replied with the truth. If I told her I'd watched the video from the parking lot, with bruises from IV lines still fresh on my arms. But I didn't respond, not yet. I wanted to see how far they'd go, pretending not to notice the silence. Spoiler alert, pretty far. Tell me, if your family chose your healthy brother over you when your life was literally on the line, would you still show up to Christmas dinner with a smile? Would you fake laughter while passing the mashed potatoes? Or would you, like me, sit in the shadows, quiet as a bomb, waiting for just the right moment to let the truth slip out? Not with anger, but with elegance? Because sometimes the sweetest revenge doesn't come with shouting or slamming doors. It comes with watching them slowly realize they taught you to be strong, and now they'll have to live with what that really means. It had been exactly 13 days since the moment I sat in my car outside the clinic, watching my brother unwrap a set of keys on camera, like it was the climax of some feel-good Hallmark movie. The kind where everyone ends up smiling around a fire, unaware that someone just off-screen is choking on the smoke. 13 days since I'd received that text from my mother. 7 words that, on the surface, sounded harmless enough, but dripped with that polished detachment I'd known my whole life. "Hey, you okay? You've been quiet lately." Quiet, as if silence was some unprovoked storm they couldn't possibly have predicted. As if I hadn't already screamed everything I could in the form of desperate phone calls, test results, medical bills stacked on my kitchen table like unopened wedding invitations. They knew. They had to know. But knowing and caring, as I've come to learn, are often galaxies apart when it comes to family. What made it worse wasn't the cabin itself. It wasn't even the fact that they'd done it so publicly, parading their generosity like a badge on their social media, using phrases like self-care and giving back, as if Jeremy had spent the past year digging ditches in a war zone instead of managing a podcast about vintage motorcycles from the comfort of his rent-free condo. No, the real gut punch came from the familiarity of it all. The way this gift, this grand gesture, felt like the natural continuation of a script they'd been following since we were kids. A script in which he was the lead actor, and I was just some forgettable supporting character written in to make him look better. I remember one particular Christmas when we were both still in school. He must have been 12 and I was 16, old enough to know better but still young enough to hope. That year, I'd asked for a used laptop, nothing fancy, just something to help with college applications. He asked for a paintball gun. On Christmas morning, I got a planner and a hardcover book about scholarship essays, while Jeremy unwrapped not 1 but 2 semi-automatic paintball rifles and a gift certificate to an indoor arena. When I looked up, my dad actually laughed and said, "Well, at least you'll be ready for Harvard, huh?" The only place I went that year was community college, part-time, between shifts at the grocery store. But that wasn't the point. The point was, it never really mattered what I needed. It only mattered how easy it was for them to ignore it. Now, watching my phone light up with photos of Jeremy, posing in front of his new mountain retreat, captioned with words like peace, healing, and deserved, I felt the same sinking in my chest I'd felt all those years ago, only now it was accompanied by the dull ache of real illness, real fatigue, and real consequences. I wasn't angry in the explosive way people think of when they imagine betrayal. I was angry in the way glaciers move. Slow, constant, quiet, but utterly unstoppable. I did what I always do when I feel like I'm floating out of my own life. I went back to work. Not literally. I'd taken leave from my administrative job at the school after the diagnosis, But emotionally, mentally, I opened a fresh notebook, the one with the maroon cover and lined pages I save for thoughts I don't want to lose in a phone note. And I started writing, not a diary, not a rant, but a list. A quiet, methodical, painfully clear list of everything I had done for them. Every holiday dinner I'd hosted, every late-night phone call I'd answered when Jeremy couldn't reach Mom, every errand I'd run, every appointment I'd driven my dad to when his sciatica flared up. I wrote until the pen left an indent on my finger, and the page was full of scribbled memories that no one had ever thanked me for, as if being the strong one automatically disqualified you from receiving kindness. And then, like clockwork, they called. First my mom, then my dad. I didn't answer either. I watched the calls roll in and imagined their faces. Concerned, confused, maybe even mildly offended. In their minds, I was the ungrateful one now. The dramatic one. The one who couldn't just be happy for her brother's good fortune. Never mind that their daughter was fighting for her life with more grit than any of them had ever shown in a crisis. Never mind that I hadn't even asked for luxury, just a loan or a co-signature or a simple show of presence. No, none of that mattered anymore. The story had shifted, and I was cast once again as the distant, bitter sister while they played the part of clueless parents just trying to do the right thing. And in case I had any doubt about the performance, the next blow came wrapped in digital perfection. A post from my father's Facebook account, shared to a private family group, showing the three of them standing on the porch of the cabin, arms around each other, smiling like some cursed painting. The caption read, "Grateful for moments like these. Family is everything." I stared at that picture for so long that my phone battery died in my hand. Family is everything. That sentence could rot. So I decided, in that moment, that I wouldn't ask again. Not for money, not for support, not for acknowledgement. What I would do, however, was wait and watch, the way you do when someone you once trusted shows you their real face. Because the beautiful thing about being underestimated is that no one sees you coming when you finally decide to act. And I wasn't just going to walk away. I was going to take back every part of myself they'd ever claimed as theirs, and I was going to make damn sure they felt it. Not with screaming, not with ultimatums, but with something far more dangerous, grace. Because nothing unsettles the self-righteous more than a woman they thought they broke, still managing to smile without them. The silence between us had begun to stretch, not like a rope pulled taut, but like a void expanding in slow motion, soundless and almost elegant in its cruelty. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel the panic I used to feel in these situations, the kind that used to grip my chest every time I felt myself drifting away from the people I was told would always be my foundation. Instead, I felt something else entirely, an unfamiliar stillness. Not peace exactly, but a sharp clarity, like looking through a window that had finally been wiped clean, after years of smudged fingerprints and fog. There is something profoundly sobering about realizing that the people who raised you don't actually see you, not really, not the way you are, or the way you fight, or the weight you carry when no one's looking, but only the version of you that best serves their narrative, the agreeable daughter, the one who nods and says, "I understand," even when her heart is breaking beneath the weight of polite smiles and perfectly timed gratitude. I had played that role for so long it had become muscle memory, offering to help clean up while they handed Jeremy another drink, brushing off backhanded compliments about how I always figure things out, while quietly arranging my own ride home, never once demanding to be noticed, only to be treated fairly. Now, though, something had shifted. Not just in my circumstances, but in me, as if the diagnosis had not only cracked my physical heart, but split open the emotional armor I'd been wearing since girlhood, leaving me raw but alert, vulnerable but impossibly focused. It was in that space, in that rawness, that I began to see not just what had happened, but what had always been happening. And that realization was not just painful, it was galvanizing. They wanted me to stay quiet. That was the unspoken rule. Keep it clean, keep it contained. Be the bigger person. Let the boy shine. Smile when they call you strong, and ignore the weight behind that word. How it often means we don't have to check on you. How it conveniently excuses their absence in moments that demanded presence. But what they hadn't counted on was that quiet can evolve. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one building something far more dangerous than anger, strategy. I didn't confront them. I didn't send a letter or make a call or write a lengthy social media post dripping with carefully crafted passive aggression. I simply watched, listened, waited. And when the time came, I acted, not out of bitterness, but out of precision. It started when I saw the flyer in my inbox, an invitation to my parents' annual Family's First charity gala, a nauseatingly themed event they'd hosted every December for the past 5 years, complete with white-gloved servers, framed photos of smiling children benefiting from their donations, and speeches about the importance of supporting women's health. I nearly laughed when I read it. How they could champion a cause they had personally turned their backs on when their own daughter needed them was beyond hypocrisy. It was delusion, but I didn't laugh. I RSVP'd. I chose +1, and I began to plan. I knew how these events worked. I'd been to them in the past, years ago, back when I still believed that showing up meant something, back when I still clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, being there would help me feel included. Even if I had to fight for air in every conversation, I remembered the small talk, the flutes of champagne, the way my mother would grip my arm just tight enough to correct my posture, whispering through her teeth, "Smile, Lauren," like I was a porcelain doll on display. So this time, I wouldn't just smile, I would shine. I bought a dress that hugged the exact places I used to hide. A shade of red so unapologetic it felt like a declaration. I had my hair done, not for vanity, but as a kind of armor. I walked into that ballroom not as the quiet daughter, not as the background character, but as someone who knew the truth and wasn't afraid to let it breathe. My +1 wasn't a date. It was my surgeon, Dr. Emily Park, a woman so brilliant and composed that her presence alone demanded attention. And when I introduced her, calmly and without theatrics, as the person who saved my life when my family told me to apply for aid, the silence that fell around our small circle was louder than any outburst I could have planned. No one said anything for several seconds. My father cleared his throat. My mother's smile faltered, just for a moment, like a mask slipping, but I didn't linger. I moved through the room like I belonged there, because I did, not because of their name or their charity, but because I had earned it in the most brutal way imaginable, through survival, and I wasn't about to waste that survival on bitterness. I wanted them to feel the dissonance. I wanted them to squirm inside the glossy packaging of their perfect image, knowing that behind the decorations and speeches, the daughter they'd pushed aside had returned not broken, but sharpened. I didn't confront them that night. That would have been too easy. Instead, I watched as my mother made her speech, her voice trembling slightly on words like support and healing, and I stood in the back, calm, composed, holding my glass with steady hands, a small knowing smile tugging at my lips. Because I understood now that the real power doesn't come from being loud. It comes from being undeniable. And when the evening ended and people filtered out into the cold winter night, whispering about what Lauren said, I didn't look back. I didn't need to because the foundation had already cracked. And once cracks begin, they only ever get wider. They taught me to be strong. I finally believed them. Now let's see how they handle the version of me they built. The truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't always walk in with fanfare or loud declarations. It slips in quietly, almost reverently, like the final piece of a puzzle you stopped trying to solve years ago, clicking into place with the kind of certainty that leaves no room for doubt. And on the night of the gala, beneath the glow of chandeliers and the clink of cocktail glasses, I realized that I was done shrinking myself into the corners of conversations, done waiting for someone to hand me the microphone or give me permission to be heard, because I finally understood that everything I'd been denying myself in the name of family, grace, space, dignity, had been mine to claim all along. The room was predictably ornate, dripping with the kind of old money elegance that tries too hard not to look like it's trying. with white linen stretched tight across tables like corsets, and centerpieces of winter roses that smelled more like perfume than flowers. The crowd, a curated collection of business acquaintances, church elders, and nonprofit executives, buzzed with polite laughter and compliments disguised as questions. "Is that vintage? You look so refreshed. Are you still working at the school?" And I smiled through it all, not because I was playing along, but because I was already 10 steps ahead of them, calmly circling the stage in my mind like a chessboard, waiting for my moment to make the only move I ever needed. When my father stepped up to introduce me, it was with the same booming charm he'd always reserved for these events, the kind that made people mistake him for generous instead of strategic, weaving in anecdotes about family values and resilience, like he hadn't quietly failed his daughter in her most vulnerable hour. He smiled too wide, his voice warm but rehearsed, painting me as a model of strength who had overcome adversity with quiet dignity, never once mentioning what that adversity actually was or how much of it was quietly orchestrated by his own neglect. And as I stood backstage, clutching the edge of the curtain, I realized that he genuinely believed his version of the story, that in his mind, what they had done, or more accurately, what they had failed to do, wasn't cruelty but simply the kind of hard choices that responsible adults make, the kind that come with age and pragmatism, and the blind belief that fairness means giving everyone what looks good, not what is needed. When he finished and the applause began, not thunderous but polite, dutiful, I walked slowly onto the stage, heels clicking softly against the polished wood, my heart not pounding but steady because I wasn't there to explode or accuse or unravel their image in some dramatic cascade of revelations. I was there to tell the truth, plainly, calmly, with the kind of poise that doesn't demand attention but earns it through sheer weight. I began not with facts but with a story, the kind people lean into instinctively, and I spoke about what it means to be seen, really seen, by the people who claim to love you, and how easy it is, when someone's been strong for too long, to forget they ever needed help at all. I told them about receiving my diagnosis, about the nights I fell asleep wondering if I would wake up, about applying for aid with trembling hands while my parents smiled in front of a mountain cabin ribboned with birthday banners. I did not name names because I didn't need to. The truth has a way of settling into the hearts of those who recognize themselves in it, and in that ballroom full of curated perfection, I saw shoulders stiffen, eyes flick sideways, glasses paused mid-sip. I spoke not as a daughter betrayed, but as a woman resurrected, not from illness, but from invisibility. And I reminded them that charity without presence is just performance, that helping strangers while abandoning your own is not generosity, it's hypocrisy with a tax deduction. I told them that silence can be a wound just as deep as words, and that pretending not to notice someone's suffering does not make you kind. It makes you a coward. By the time I finished, the room was quiet in that peculiar way that happens when people are deciding whether to clap or confess, when they're unsure if what they've heard was a eulogy or a rebirth. And I walked off that stage not with triumph, but with the serenity of someone who no longer needed validation because I hadn't told my story to be applauded. I had told it because it was mine, and because telling it out loud made it real in a way their silence never could. My mother didn't look at me for the rest of the evening. My father left halfway through dessert, muttering something about an early meeting, though everyone knew he was retreating, not departing. Jeremy, oddly, was the only one who clapped without hesitation, his face unreadable, his expression hovering somewhere between admiration and guilt, like a man watching his sister become someone he'd never bothered to meet. And as I stood near the coat check, sipping water that tasted metallic in my mouth, a woman I didn't recognize came up to me, clutching her purse like it held all the answers, and whispered, "Thank you for saying what so many of us never get the chance to." I nodded, not because I needed the compliment, but because I understood the cost of silence better than most. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. And as the city lights blurred past my cab window on the way home, I realized that the most powerful kind of revenge isn't the one that burns bridges. It's the one that builds a new path entirely, a path they'll never be invited to walk. Because I had spoken the truth, and whether they acknowledged it or not, it had been heard. There's something eerie about the silence that follows a well-placed truth, the kind that doesn't just expose a wound, but forces the people responsible for it to stare directly into the gash they pretended didn't exist. And in the days after the gala, I found myself floating in that silence like a woman who'd finally surfaced after years underwater, blinking into the harsh daylight with lungs full of air she had forgotten she was allowed to breathe. They didn't call, not at first, and I didn't expect them to, not because I had any illusions left about who they were or what they were capable of, but because people like them don't apologize until their own comfort is threatened, until the story they've told about themselves starts to fray at the edges and the risk of being seen for what they are outweighs the inconvenience of contrition. I received one text, 3 days after the gala, at exactly 9:23 in the morning, a time so ordinary it almost felt strategic, as if my mother had deliberately chosen it to make her message seem casual, as if the past month hadn't split our relationship down the middle, like a fault line finally giving way under pressure. It read simply, "We're not sure what's going on with you lately. You've changed." No punctuation, no question mark. Just a passive accusation tucked inside a statement that pretended to be concerned, but was in truth nothing more than an indictment. An implication that the problem wasn't their betrayal or their absence or their performative loyalty, but my failure to continue pretending that everything was fine. And in that moment, reading those 7 words while sitting alone in my kitchen, with the morning light slanting through the blinds and the scent of stale coffee hanging in the air, I felt no anger, no sadness, no urge to reply or explain or soften the edges of what I had become. Because they were right, I had changed. Not suddenly and not without pain, but gradually, deliberately, like a woman who had finally outgrown the skin she was told to wear her whole life. I had changed in the way people do when they stop mistaking survival for gratitude, when they stop accepting scraps and start demanding space, when they realize that being the strong one is only admirable to those who benefit from your silence. So I didn't respond, not right away. I let that message sit in my phone like a bruise, dark and tender and familiar, and instead I went for a walk. The kind of long, aimless walk that people take when they're not running from anything, but are no longer afraid to be seen. I ended up outside the cabin, Jeremy's gift, the monument to all the unspoken hierarchies that had governed our family for decades, standing in the cold with my coat zipped to my chin and my hands buried deep in my pockets. The house was quiet, the driveway empty, the windows reflecting the bare trees like watchful eyes. And for a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the sharp winter air, letting the stillness settle into my bones. I didn't go there to vandalize it or make a scene or leave some dramatic symbol on the porch. I went there to see it for what it was. Not a retreat, not a prize, but a symbol of what had always been true. That my needs had never mattered as much as his comfort. That love in our family had always been conditional, transactional, filtered through the lens of what was convenient and publicly palatable. And standing there, watching the clouds shift in the reflection of those pristine windows, I realized something that startled me, not because it was new, but because I had never allowed myself to say it out loud before. I was done trying to belong to people who only made space for me when it served their image. I pulled out my phone, took a photo of my boots against the snowy gravel at the edge of the driveway, and sent it in reply to my mother's text. No caption, no explanation, just a picture, grounded and quiet and final, like the last page of a book that no longer needed a sequel. I didn't know if she would understand the message. I didn't care, because the point wasn't what she saw. It was what I was done hiding. I walked away from that cabin without looking back, not because I was trying to be poetic, but because I had nothing left to find there. Whatever family meant before had been burned away in the heat of their indifference, and what remained was something I could finally see for what it was. A story I had been told, not one I had written. And now, with nothing left to lose, I could begin my own. What happened next isn't some tidy epilogue wrapped in reconciliation or grand gestures of regret. There were no tearful apologies or sudden awakenings. There were only more silences, longer gaps between texts, occasional photos of family gatherings I was no longer invited to or simply chose not to attend. And beneath it all, a steady, growing peace that comes from no longer needing to perform your pain for the sake of people who refused to witness it in the first place. I didn't get revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't destroy them or shame them or expose them in some viral post. I did something far more devastating to people like them. I lived, fully, unapologetically, without them. And I made it clear, not with words but with action, that their approval was no longer the currency I traded in. So when people ask if I've changed, I say yes. Yes, I have. I changed in the way women do when they finally understand that being good doesn't mean being silent, that being kind doesn't mean being a doormat, that being family doesn't mean being sacrificed. I changed because I had to. I changed because I wanted to. I changed because the alternative was staying in a role I never auditioned for, in a play I never believed in, written by people who never asked what my story actually was. And maybe that's the point in the end. Not to punish, not to destroy, but to walk away so fully, so completely, that they are left to live in the hollow space where your presence used to be, wondering not just what they lost, but why they never really knew what they had.